Okay, today Dr. Gooch is here to tell us about the Hinsonville. She has, by the way, she has books back here and a display, so please be sure and take a look before you leave. And I'm sure her book will be every bit as good as her program. And I welcome you. I was told I wasn't allowed to say too much about her.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. Thank you, Carol and members of the East Brandywine Historical Commission for inviting me to discuss some of my research, in particular, Hinsonville's Heroes, Black Civil War Soldiers of Chester County, Pennsylvania. Can everyone hear me? Well, okay, great. If I need to project more, let me know. Patriotism and our shared history. What to the American is patriotism? How do we express our patriotism, our love for country, while embracing our diverse, complex history as Americans? These, I believe, are crucial questions, especially in this current social political environment. Dr. Martin Luther King, in his 1962 speech for the New York Civil War Centennial Commission's Emancipation Proclamation observance, he said, quote, "If our nation had done nothing more in its whole history than to create just two documents, its contribution to civilization would be imperishable. Those two documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation." To paraphrase Dr. King, he said the Emancipation Proclamation had four enduring results. First, it gave to the executive power, gave force to the executive power to change conditions in the national interest on a broad and far-reaching scale. Second, it dealt a devastating blow to the system of slaveholding. Third, it empowered Americans of African descent to play a significant role in their own liberation. And fourth, the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, quote, "resurrected and restated the principle of equality upon which the founding of the nation rested." The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, freed Americans of African descent held in bondage in states that were at the time in rebellion against the Union. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation also declared that Americans of African descent will be received into the armed service of the United States. African Americans could fight for the reunification of the United States. In May 1863, the War Department issued the order establishing the Bureau of Colored Troops to recruit and retain African American soldiers who became known as USCTs, United States Colored Troops. How many of you have heard that term before? A few? Okay. And Section 6, and sir, I won't have you read this now. I won't have you read this. I'll read it for you, okay? This is, sure. If any of you like to read it, you can. General Order number 43, which established the United States Colored Troops. It said this: "Colored troops may be accepted by companies to be afterwards consolidated in battalions and regiments by the adjutant general. The regiments will be numbered seriatim in the order in which they are raised, the numbers to be determined by the adjutant general. They will be designated regiments of United States colored troops. Well, the role of Black Civil War soldiers as agents of emancipation and shapers of our American democracy is an intriguing yet often undertold story. Hinsonville's Heroes examines the lives of 18 men from this former free Black community in southeast Pennsylvania who served among the more than 180,000 USCTs who fought to reunify our country and liberate more than 4 million Americans from slavery, including many of my ancestors in North Carolina. Now, I first encountered these burials in 2012 while I was serving as dean at Lincoln University. Now, not only had I never heard the term United States Colored Troops, I did not know that USCTs were part of the Union forces at the sites of 2 of the Civil War's major surrenders in April 1865, Appomattox, Virginia, and Durham, North Carolina, and I'll talk about those shortly. So, as a historian, all research begins with questions. For me, the revolving questions were, who were these USCT veterans? What were their and Hinsonville's relationship to Lincoln University? And this is the traditional historic arch to the entrance to the campus of Lincoln University, which was chartered in 1854 as Ashman Institute. Ashman Institute to honor Jehudi Ashman, who was a missionary and an agent for the American Colonization Society, which established in 1822 the country of Liberia with financing from the US government. And the purpose of the colony of Liberia, West Africa, was to settle formerly enslaved and free Blacks. Now, the American colonization movement was an alternative. The American colonization movement was an alternative to the immediate abolition of slavery, supported both by slaveholders and some abolitionists, which I address in my book, On Africa's Lands. So Ashman Institute was founded by supporters of Liberian colonization, relocating formerly enslaved and free Blacks to Africa. They were mostly anti-abolition, imagine that. In 1866, Ashman Institute was renamed Lincoln University Emancipator President Abraham Lincoln. Yet before Ashman Institute was even an idea, Hinsonville was settled in the 1820s and 30s by free and determined to be free Black Americans, many of whom migrated or immigrated from Maryland, Delaware, and other parts of Chester and Delaware counties here in Pennsylvania. They organized and built Hosanna Church, which actually hosted abolitionist meetings and whose members operated within an interracial and extensive network of abolitionists within Pennsylvania and the region. It's amazing the history of that collaboration here in Chester County and beyond. Hinsonville took its name from Emory Hinson, who was the first known Black landowner. Now, Hinsonville has disappeared from most contemporary maps. It was located about 26 miles southwest of Downingtown, near and at the site now known as Lincoln University, which consists of approximately, oh, why did I do that, sorry, approximately 422 acres, which encompasses former Hinsonville homesteads and businesses. Now, 10 of the 18 men who served are buried at Hosanna Church Cemetery near the entrance to Lincoln University, which some of their ancestors helped establish in 1854. These veterans and their families, I realized as I walked around in that cemetery, they arranged for the placements of these monuments to remind us of their sacrifice and service. And so the goal of my research became how to rescue these patriots from obscurity and place them into our shared American historical memory, our shared American history.
Samuel Henry Blake, 127th Regiment, United States Colored Troops.
The other names too. Go ahead, read all of them. Finish reading those. No, there are 6 there.
Oh, you want me to read?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Charles William Cole, 24th Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops. James Cole, 54th Massachusetts. Joshua Cole, 54th Massachusetts. Amos Dawes, 127th Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops. And George W. Duffy, 22nd U.S. Colored Troops.
Robert G. Fitzgerald, 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. William B. Fitzgerald, 41st U.S. CT. Hugh Hall, 25th U.S. CT. Isaac Amos Hollingsworth, 127th U.S. CT. George J., 54th Massachusetts. Wesley J., 54th Massachusetts.
William J., 54th Massachusetts. Lewis Palmer, 25th USCT. Lewis W. Ringgold, 25th USCT. Stephen J. Ringgold, 22nd USCT. Abraham Stout, 41st USCT. And Albert G. Walls, 54th Massachusetts.
Before and after the War Department issued the order establishing the Bureau of Colored Troops, the men of Hinsonville took decisive actions to enlist, inspired by activists like Frederick Douglass. Following the 1863 Confederate defeats in Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Mississippi, this tireless advocate for the enlistment of black men was on his feet, holding forth in Philadelphia, where 6 Hinsonville men had already enlisted in the famed 54th Massachusetts. He said, "Young men of Philadelphia, you are without excuse. The hour has arrived, and your place is in the Union Army. Remember that the musket, the United States musket with its bayonet of steel, better than all mere parchment, guarantees liberty. In your hands, that musket means liberty, and should your constitutional right at the close of the war be denied, which in the nature of things it cannot be, your brethren are safe while you have a constitution which proclaims your right to keep and bear arms." So Frederick Douglass tells them, your roles as soldiers will transform you into agents of emancipation. He made his rounds throughout Pennsylvania, including Delaware County and Chester County, in the Hinsonville area where he had spent time previously attending abolitionist meetings. So his message of emancipation, okay, resonated with these men from Hinsonville who heeded the call. One of those men was Christian Fleetwood, who matriculated at and graduated from Ashman Institute in 1861, and actually was a Medal of Honor recipient for his valor. He said, "A double purpose induced me and most others to enlist, to assist in abolishing slavery and to save the country from ruin." So said this patriot. And this one of your neighbors, Josiah Cole, who was buried here in Downingtown. After the war, immigrated from Hinsonville up here to Downingtown, where he was married. He owned a small farm and attended the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was located near where the old cemetery is. It's called Lindley Hill Cemetery. So this was a church. This is here in Downingtown. And I had a chance to visit his burial, and you see it's a decorated burial. And apparently the original church, I saw the ruins of it there adjacent to the cemetery. So that's Lindley Hill Cemetery here in Downingtown. He also heeded the call. So 11 of these 18 men enlisted at a Westchester, Pennsylvania recruiting office, as I was telling your colleague here, which was located at 30 Gay Street in Westchester, and trained at the former Camp William Penn near Philadelphia. It's actually in Cheltenham Township. The first and largest federal training ground for USCTs, more than 11,000 soldiers and 11 regiments trained there between 1863 and 1865. So what I address in my work, Hinsonville's Heroes, is the experience of these men, in part as soldiers, but mostly as veterans. Of the 18 Hinsonville men who enlisted, 16 survived, which was amazing, given that a number of them were involved in high casualty battles, including Fort Wagner in Charleston. 16 survived the war, but were not well or whole after the war. And here's where the story begins. During active duty, they incurred diseases and injuries that affected them the rest of their lives. And the average monthly pension around 1865 was $8. That's equivalent to approximately $141.11 today. Monthly pensions, sometimes slightly increased with changes in pension laws, but rarely enough to sustain them and their families. These men, these patriots, who fought to preserve the Union, lived in or near abject poverty for the rest of their lives. Lewis Palmer, a worthy man of good habits, and I'll read a brief excerpt. Lewis Palmer knew he would never again regain his health, as his doctor submitted a 1902 affidavit supporting a request for more pension money. He was in bad shape, unable to work, and deserved more support. He had heart disease and chronic muscle and joint pain, especially in his lower back. Lewis, quote, is incapacitated from earning a living and has been for a long period of time. He is a worthy man of good habits, said his doctor, who had been treating him for 32 years. A worthy man of good habits, Lewis hadn't been a healthy man since he enlisted, but did not file a pension claim until May of 1880. A member of the 25th USCT, he had been injured at Fort Barrancas, Florida in 1864 while lifting and mounting heavy cannons. Examining physicians gave Lewis, then 38 years old, which entitled him to a $2 monthly pension. That's equivalent to about $50.27 today. Lewis filed claims for increases in 1882, 1883, 1887, 1889, and 1897, by which time he was receiving $6 per month. He explained his desperation to a local physician, hoping an increase would be forthcoming. This is what he said: "I am a laborer, and I am able to work half of my time, and then I am not able to do hard manual labor. I have not earned more than $3. Injury to my side and back, which received while in service, is the principal cause of my disability." Lewis filed again in 1901 and 1902 for increases, undergoing more examinations of his weakened body. In 1903, his ailments included kidney disease, qualified him for an increase to $8 per month. His monthly pension remained at $8 until 1912, when he received an increase to $21.50 per month. That's about $572 today, due to new pension laws. So what's happening with Lewis Palmer, a worthy man of good habits, and his comrades? Many of them had been farm laborers before the war, right? And as they, aged, their injuries and illnesses prohibited them from, very hard or intensive physical labor. So increasingly, they are filing for benefits and increases. So 3 years later, he died at the age of 72 from kidney failure. Heart valve disease and asthma were contributing factors. He rests in Hosanna Cemetery. He died on January 5th, 1915, 51 years to the date he enlisted in the U.S. Army. January 5th, 1864, a worthy man of good habits. George Duffy of the 22nd USCT, like many of his Hinsonville comrades, encountered difficulties in obtaining pension benefits, and I think you'll find his case interesting, which speaks to our complex social history. In 1905, he hired a notary public to certify his response to the U.S. Pension Office that required him to provide proof of his family church or the location of the Harford County, Maryland plantation where he was born into slavery. He was required to provide proof of his family church, or essentially a certificate of baptism, or something to verify where he had been enslaved or born into slavery. That's interesting. In his late 60s, George was crippled in his left leg, blind in his right eye, and enduring constant pain in his left eye and head, all of which had been reported to examining physicians since 1877, when he began receiving a $4 per month pension for the leg injury he incurred. George's physicians, commanding officer, and unit mates who witnessed the injury provided statements that helped him eventually secure a partial disability. He received an increase to $6 in 1881 and to $8 in 1890 after a surgeon noted his increasing lameness. Now, by 1904, colleagues, this honorably discharged veteran, fully disabled and unable to work, direly needed money to support himself and his family, help that hinged on proving where his family worshiped and lived while enslaved. While whether free or self-liberated, George was likely born to enslaved parents in Harford County, Maryland, based on the records I've examined, parents from whom he had been separated by the time he enlisted in 1864. Identifying himself as a farmer and a free man, he enlisted in the United States Army as a free man. Exhausted from his leg pain, years of hard work, and encroaching illnesses, and struggling to get higher payments, George instructed the notary public to tell the pension office what should be obvious. Quote, "He cannot furnish a certified copy of family church or plantation and has no way of getting one." In 1906, his monthly payment increased to $12 for his leg wound, impaired vision, heart disease, bronchitis, and rheumatism. "I am unable to do any labor," said the nearly 70-year-old who died in 1907. According to the tax assessor, he left no real or personal property except for his household furniture valued at $30. Having fought a war intended to improve their lives, many black veterans struggled to attain equitable compensation for injuries and diseases they incurred during that war, as seen in the examples of Lewis, Palmer, and George Duffy. So there was a study published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2010 that examined pension approval rates for Civil War veterans by race and medical conditions between 1865 and 1906. Okay? So clearly the research here shows that black veterans, compared to white veterans, indeed were shortchanged. According to the article, the pension claims of whites had higher percentages of approval than similar pension claims for blacks. So on the left-hand side, you'll see, and I just used three major or recurring categories that I saw in these pension files of the Hinsonville men. So general category of injury. Claims filed by whites, 79% were approved compared to 44%, the same category by blacks. Diarrhea, which was a common ailment for all Civil War soldiers, especially the ones that I examined, 74% claims were approved for whites compared to 24% by blacks. Similarly, arthritis and rheumatism, 65% approval for whites, 49% approval for blacks. So, these pension laws and practices, there were a number of factors that were, informed these decisions. So you had discrimination against black troops during the war, included limited regimental hospital care, which made it difficult in some cases for them to provide evidence or proof of their injuries and illnesses, which was not an uncommon experience for black soldiers. The discretion allotted to local physicians and pension bureau officials often undermined the pension claim process that was purportedly colorblind. Yet we know from a close study of our shared American history that racial discrimination was legally sanctioned from the founding of our country through the 20th century, and during the 19th and 20th century, when these veterans were applying for pensions, black Americans faced discrimination in most areas of their lives. So officials could easily deny black veterans pension claims. Even some of the examining physicians I found in examining these records seemed reticent, if not negligent, in properly diagnosing some of the illnesses that these men reported. So let's move on to our battles and the conclusion of my brief comments. More than 5,000 USCTs were among the Union forces that cornered Robert E. Lee's army, forcing him to surrender. How many, I'm just curious, of us, until recently were aware that nearly 5,000 USCTs were present at Appomattox? We often see these iconic photographs of Robert E. Lee and, of course, Ulysses S. Grant, but seldom do we have any indication of the presence of USCTs, including some of our Chester County patriots. And the National Park Service is doing a wonderful job. If you go to just Google USCTs at Appomattox, you can actually go through and see their names and regiments, all right? But they were played a significant role in chasing down Robert E. Lee's army, cornering it, and forcing their surrender. And again, this is something relatively new for me in terms of, that's why I love lifelong learning. This information, this documented, vetted history, okay, was really not a part of my formal education and study as I came along. So again, kudos to the National Park Service for picking up and documenting this history and sharing it with us. And this is just another historical image of the surrender at Appomattox, and on the right there are some USCT reenactors here in Chester County educating people about that. Bennett Place, Durham, North Carolina, was the site of the last surrender of a major Confederate army in the Civil War. It occurred on April 26, 1865, when General Joseph Johnston surrendered to General Sherman, William Sherman. It's now a state historic site and museum, and historically, again, we hear less about this significant surrender that in effect ended the rebellion, often eclipsed by coverage of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, which occurred on April 15, 1865. Nonetheless, it is significant for our awareness of African American soldiers' service to the refining of our democracy, an extension of civil rights to formerly enslaved Americans. Formerly enslaved Americans. There were, at this, really the largest Confederate Army surrender, even larger than Robert E. Lee's army. There were 9 USCT regiments present, including Mr. Ephraim Slaughter's 37th Regiment, which helped secure the decisive Union victory. Slaughter escaped from slavery from somewhere in North Carolina and joined the U.S. Army. And this patriot said, quote, "I escaped slavery and served God, country, and mankind." Mr. Slaughter witnessed the rebel surrender, moved to and settled in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where he lived until 1946. He was 95. And at the time of his passing, he was the city's last Civil War survivor and is memorialized there in the National Civil War Museum. I escaped slavery and served God, country, and mankind. Now, this gets exciting. That would be me. What's going on there? There's a story in that image. And absorb that. What is she doing? Why is Cheryl Gooch standing in front of a Confederate battle flag? So let's think about our shared American narrative. Representations of that shared American narrative and how it varies. This Confederate defeat at Bennett Place, North Carolina, Durham, North Carolina, ensured the definitive liberation of many of my maternal and paternal ancestors who lived nearby in Granville County, approximately 30 miles from this site. Bennett Farm during the 19th and 20th centuries was a popular site for Confederate veterans who are pictured here on the left. This is a photograph from the North Carolina State Museum and Archives. This was a site for many years for Confederate veteran reunions and purported reconciliation ceremonies, while Confederate monuments were being erected there in North Carolina, the region, and across the country. So I had a chance to visit that site and thought, well, this is interesting. I noticed a number of people posing in front of this Confederate battle flag, which happened to be the 51st Confederate State Army's regiment from Goldsburg, proudly, okay? You know, perhaps some of them were descendants of members of that regiment or other regiments from North Carolina. Well, I'm a descendant as well, because this Confederate monument, which was erected in 1905 in nearby Oxford, North Carolina, my ancestral home, was quietly removed in 2020. I hated to see it go because I have a very, I think, inclusive view of how we can use monuments and artifacts to educate and broaden our understanding of our history. But anyway, it was quietly removed in 2020. And the gentleman standing there, that handsome gentleman, is Silas Gooch, who was more than 100 years old when this photograph was taken. I often, by the way, that was my great-great-great-grandfather. You may see some resemblance. Yeah. Okay. I often refer to this juxtaposition of images as the symbol of defeat in the face of victory. Slavery did not end upon the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Slavery in the United States did not end on June 19th, 1865, in Galveston, Texas, now celebrated as Juneteenth. Slavery in the United States formally ended in December of 1865 upon the ratification of the 13th Amendment. In closing, these next two final images, I hope, capture both demonstrations and expressions of Civil War Union veterans about their sacrifice for a unified United States and their desire that generations of Americans, including us, will uphold that unity. I love this photograph. It's from a Grand Army of the Republic, GAR, which was a veterans organization, advocacy, that had both integrated but mostly segregated branches or posts. But this is from a post near Syracuse, New York, around 1900. And you'll notice that it's integrated. But there's a Grand Army of the Republic song that I quote in my book that I'd like to share with you. I promise you I won't sing it. I'll just read a brief excerpt. It says, "We're old, weary soldiers. Our battles are over. Our footsteps are feeble. We're nearing the shore. We're slowly and surely approaching the crossing. A little while longer and all will be over. When my comrades and I pass through the dark valley, will you still be faithful? Will you remain true? When the graves mark the spot where the soldiers are resting, remember, we saved this great union for you." Patriotism in our shared heritage. This is another of my favorite images. It's a Grand Army of the Republic parade in New York City in 1912. Grand Army of the Republic members parading in New York on May 30th. That era during which government sanctioned racial discrimination was the norm, yet there they are, marching, exhibiting patriotism. So let us continue to learn about these historically overlooked patriots from Pennsylvania and nationwide who sacrificed to restore and reform our democracy, colleagues, and secure equality and freedom for all of us. Hinsonville Heroes, our shared American history and patriotism. Thank you. Questions, thoughts? Are you, do you know the road that Lindley Hill Cemetery is on? Okay, you have to Google it. I don't remember right.
Winding Way.
Yeah, Winding Way, that's it, that's right, yeah.
Is Cole the only man buried there?
Josiah Cole, when you say only man, what do you mean?
Is he the only soldier buried in that cemetery?
No, I think there are other USCTs, but he is one of my guys from Hinsonville.
Okay.
Yeah, but there are, I believe I saw some other decorated graves there.
If you're saying Winding Way, it's in North Woodmont?
I don't know.
There's a cemetery back
When you
there.
were talking
There's
about it, I
cemeteries.
just Googled it to see.
I'll go back there and look, yeah.
Oh, there are quite a few burials
Yeah,
out there.
yeah.
And Winding Way
There's
sounds
there.
familiar. I went out there a couple of years ago.
There's a Winding Way in North Woodmont, and I think that that cemetery is in the back there. And I thought that, the mayor of Downingtown was gonna go in there and clean it, Josh. When he
Yeah.
was mayor, was gonna go in there and they were gonna clean it up and so forth.
Well, there have been, from what I recall, a few of those efforts to clean it up and,
Yeah.
maybe some Boy Scout troops were there as
Right,
well.
right.
It is still owned by the African American Church, which is relocated into Downingtown. And it's still an active congregation, yes.
The AME church is not really that far, it would be down Norwood Road, there on the corner. Yeah.
Okay, so the AME, African American Episcopal Church here in Downingtown is an active congregation. They built that particular edifice in 1892. But prior to that, beginning in 1851, there was a church out, I guess that's Winding Way. And you can see the ruins of that former church. And that is an expansive cemetery. There are a lot of burials there. Interesting. So you have a lot of history here to further explore, colleagues. Yes, sir?
Well, I want to thank you for challenging us with the truth, because we seem to live in an age many do not want to hear the truth. And so thank you for that. My question about Lincoln University, I was sad to hear Lincoln is closing.
No, really?
Did I just hear that?
I have not heard that. Really?
No?
No, I believe.
Okay, that may be a falsehood, maybe I'm dreaming.
Okay.
But I thought I just.
I am not
so
aware.
I'll
Yeah.
check that. Don't-
Yeah. I mean, they just held commencement. I hope not. Yeah. And I haven't heard from any of my former colleagues that there was any such plan.
Yeah.
It is a state university.
It is state affiliated. Mhm.
It's like Penn State, Pitt. It's a state-related university.
Right, state related. Mhm.
When you started your study,
Yes.
what was your hypothesis about the Hinsonville people? What were you trying to, what was your question that you were looking for?
Well, when I arrived at Lincoln University, I believe it was 2012, I was just insatiably curious. I said, what is the relationship of that historic church and cemetery to the university? Because it's right next door, but it's always been a separately owned property. And I was astonished that most of my faculty and staff colleagues said, well, we really don't know. And I said, well, why don't we know? What's the relationship? So at first I wanted to find out what the relationship is, and I realized when I began researching that that church and that community, the church is the remaining artifact of a formerly vibrant, productive, largely free African-American community from the antebellum period, right? So I realized that the epicenter of the founding of what became Lincoln University was in Hinsonville, right? And so I began to research the relationship between the founders and Hinsonville and built from there. But I think with regard to these USCTs, and when I stepped into Hosanna Church Cemetery back in 2012, I had not at that point seen as many burials of Black Civil War soldiers before in one place, in a private church cemetery. I said, wow. So I think it became an act of restorative justice to, as I said, rescue them from obscurity, to flesh out their lives as best I could and place them back into our historical narrative. So that is local history, that is Pennsylvania history, that is United States history. So I began with the why and the who and determined that we needed to expand our awareness of the role of these men in reunifying our country.
Were there any black soldiers in the Confederate?
No. Okay, so contrary to the Confederate States of America Army did not enlist African American soldiers. There was some discussion of it toward the end, and there may have been the formation of a regiment, and Robert E. Lee was saying, look, we need manpower, let's get the slaves to fight. And I believe they actually organized and began drilling, but they never enlisted and served. Now, the Confederate States Army did in fact use a very large population of enslaved people as laborers. When they were coming up to Gettysburg and on to, to Harper's Ferry, there were thousands of free African Americans who were seized by Robert E. Lee and his army and taken captive. We really don't know what happened to them, okay? But the idea was to seize as many African Americans and return them to slavery. So you will see evidence here and there of African Americans within the in the employ, if you will, of the Confederate States Army, loading canyons and doing a number of things, but they were not enlisted soldiers, never.
What is the formal name of Hosanna Church? Do you know?
I do.
Go ahead.
Okay, it's Hosanna, AUMP, African Union Methodist Protestant. Now, that is interesting. The AUMP predates the AME by about 3 years and is the oldest African American or independent African American denomination, and it's still active. AUMP, African Union Methodist Protestant.
And they were organized as a result of the slavery issue. What was, it brings back some memories of that. Were they originally a Southern church?
No. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME, which was founded by, the famous Richard Allen,
Yes.
was prevalent in the North, Mid-Atlantic, and the South.
Right.
And after Richard Allen's death, there were basically break-off groups, and that's how it was formed. But the AUMP denomination was formed in my hometown of Wilmington, Delaware in 1813. It was incorporated in 1813 in Wilmington, Delaware. And that was a largely free African-American population, which of course welcomed and ministered to people who were still enslaved. So AUMP was formed out of or from or apart from the AME denomination. Did you get all that down? Did you take copious notes, sir? Okay, all right. Yes, Carol?
I read the other day that the colored troops were not given uniforms and had to buy their own. Is that correct?
That is not true. They received uniforms and they received weapons. I mean, there was certainly disparity in terms of pay. I mean, that's well documented. And there may have been cases where they received, and I don't want to overgeneralize this, but perhaps materials and equipment of lesser quality, but generally that was not true. If you take, for example, the 54th Massachusetts, they were very, very well equipped. And they were one of approximately 200 USCT regiments formed. But no, they absolutely received uniforms.
Question on that is, some of the troops were the colored troops and others were part of, how did they determine whether to have the separate colored troops or whether to be a part of?
Yeah, it depended how they were formed, but even the regiments, And the question is, was there a difference between those who had state designations and those who were USCTs? They were all USCTs. They were all United States Colored Troops. It's just in some cases, such as the 54th Massachusetts and the 5th Massachusetts and the 55th Massachusetts, they retained their state designations when they were formed. But they were all United States Colored Troops. Do you have a question? You've been listening intently? No? Not yet? Okay. So I'll put on my professor hat and begin calling on people. I have to resist that urge. Yes, ma'am?
You were mentioning the monument that was quietly removed.
Yes.
And I feel the same way that you do, that they should not be removed. Where that monument is.
No,
It isn't protected.
I don't know. So that's Granville County, North Carolina, my ancestral home. And I think amidst the protests, some of them were, defaced or damaged or vandalized, and it was decided that they would remove it and place it someplace else. Now, when I made that remark about my preference as an educator, that there be a conversation about how to expand the interpretation of existing monuments. I somewhat lament that that conversation in the midst of, the protests did not have a chance to take place. But I, at the same time, respect the feelings that it evokes for people, whatever side of the issue you're on. So I don't mean to imply that my overarching preference should be that they remain. I think each community needs to decide. It is certainly offensive, traumatic for some people to see those. I mean, look at the case of Silas Gooch, my handsome great-great-great-grandfather, who was born into slavery, lived to see freedom in 1865, and in 1902, he was still alive and walked past that, right? If he was going to do business there at the county courthouse where it was located, which was clearly a reminder to people like him who had been enslaved, that there was a persistent social order, right? That placed and minimized him and people like him, right? Their humanity, their status. So I don't know what that evoked for him. I don't know what it evokes for any of you, right? What I'm saying is that as an educator, I was very excited about the opportunity, such as what Baltimore was able to do. One of the former mayors appointed a commission to study this. It was representative, it was diverse, and it was decided prior to, and what they did, they went around to all of these Confederate monuments and developed and placed expanded interpretation boards, which said, this is what that really represented. These were placed during the era of government-sanctioned discrimination. People were being discriminated in terms of housing and employment. So you get the context, right? So for me, the insatiably curious historian and educator, there's a monument, I have an app, I have a global audience, right? If I didn't have to work for a living, I would go around and do these stand-ups talking about this broader history. But because of what happened, with the tragic, really killings of civilians and the protests that followed, it just got away from that, I guess, that hopefulness for some of us that we could have some extended or expanded conversations. But mind you, not every community wants to do that, right? So that's the context of my statement. Monuments in and of themselves aren't history. They aren't necessarily artifacts of history. They are glimpses of history, okay? So that Confederate, Granville Confederate monument that was placed in Oxford, North Carolina, was not a full inclusive history. It was a certain viewpoint of history, right? So I think we should be careful not to over-invest our belief in monuments as representative of history, of our shared history. There are a lot more stories attached to those monuments and artifacts. So you had another question, did I answer that? Okay, yes. Mhm.
It always surprised me. I was an immigrant in the United States. I didn't study American history, but it always, as a child, but it always surprised me when I got here to discover that the Army, the armed forces of the United States, were not actually integrated until after World War II.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering how this history in this long, long period of segregation, how you feel about this Civil War where they, African-American soldiers fought in separate groups, how that led to this long, long, or was the foundation of the way that African-American soldiers were segregated right up through 1947.
Well, I mean, African Americans have fought in every war in America, you know, Revolutionary, 1812 and onward, right? So my feeling is that there is always an opportunity to know more, to offer broader, expansive, more inclusive interpretations, and to share that. That's my approach. Yeah, but I mean, that's the beauty for me of, education and lifelong learning. There's so much more to discover. Well, I do teach when I can, but I'm actually in academic leadership and have been for a while. But I'm currently serving as Vice President for Academic Affairs at SUNY Schenectady, near Albany, New York. So I divide my time between Schenectady and my home here in Wilmington. Okay? Okay. Thank you for your help, sir. I appreciate it. All right, thank you.
Appreciate you.